Get up. You don't belong here." Those 6 words were the last mistake Abigail Sterling ever made as a member of high society. Standing in the aisle of a transatlantic flight dripping in diamonds and entitlement, she thought she was simply putting a confused woman in her place. She looked at the black woman, sitting comfortably in seat 1A, and saw nothing but an intruder. But Abigail missed the details. She didn't notice the customized stitching on the leather. She didn't notice the flight attendant's terrified silence, and she certainly didn't know that the woman she was screaming at wasn't just a passenger. She was the owner of the very jet Abigail was standing on. What happened next wasn't just a removal. It was the most brutal, satisfying instant karma the aviation world has ever seen. This is the story of how one woman's prejudice cost her everything. The air in the exclusive Vanguard lounge at JFK Airport smelled of expensive espresso and old money. This wasn't just first class. This was the private charter terminal, a place where the world's elite waited for their Gulfstreams and bombardiers without having to rub shoulders with the general public. Dr. Elena Vance sat in a secluded corner, typing furiously on her tablet. Dressed in a beige cashmere oversized sweater and black leggings with her hair pulled back in a messy bun, she looked comfortable. To the untrained eye, she might have looked like a student or an assistant. To the trained eye, the vintage Patek Philippe watch on her wrist whispered a different story. Elena was tired. She had just finished a grueling week of negotiations in New York for her tech conglomeration, Vance Holloway Systems. Now she just wanted to get back to London. She had chartered her own company's flagship jet, the Gulfstream G700, but had agreed to let the charter management company sell the extra seats to offset costs, a decision she was about to regret. Across the lounge, the automatic door slid open, and a whirlwind of noise entered. "Richard, I explicitly told the driver to wait at the north gate. Now my Vuitton trunk has a scuff. A scuff." Richard, Abigail Sterling marched in her heels, clacking aggressively against the polished marble. She was a woman who wore her wealth like armor, a Chanel suit that was a season too loud oversized sunglasses indoors, and a look of permanent disdain etched onto her face. Trailing behind her was Richard Sterling, a man who looked like he had been shrinking for the last 20 years of their marriage. He was holding 3 passports and looking apologetic. Elena glanced up over the rim of her reading glasses, then went back to her work. "Abigail, please," Richard hissed. "People are watching." "Let them watch," Abigail snapped, scanning the room. Her eyes landed on Eleanor in the corner. Abigail's nose wrinkled. "I thought this lounge was exclusive. Since when do they let support staff wait in the main area?" Elena heard it. She didn't react. She simply took a sip of her sparkling water. Abigail, feeling ignored, walked up to the concierge desk, where a young man named Marcus was organizing boarding passes. "Excuse me," Abigail said, pointing a manicured finger toward Elena. "Is that woman supposed to be here? This is the Vanguard lounge. My husband paid a premium to avoid the riffraff." Marcus, who knew exactly who Elena was, stiffened. "Mrs. Sterling, all guests in the lounge have been verified. Can I get you a glass of champagne before boarding?" "I don't want champagne, I want standards," Abigail muttered loud enough for the room to hear. She glared at Elena one last time. "Unbelievable. Probably won a lottery ticket or used miles. Ruins the whole atmosphere." Elena finally stopped typing. She turned her head, slowly locking eyes with Abigail. Elena didn't frown. She didn't look angry. She looked amused. It was the look a lioness gives a yapping chihuahua before looking away. "Is there a problem?" Elena asked, her voice smooth and calm. Abigail scoffed. "Not yet. But I'm sure there will be once we're in the air." Richard pulled Abigail away. Honey, come on. The flight is boarding in 10 minutes. As they walked away, Elena pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to the pilot, Captain James Miller. Text: Prepare for turbulence. Passenger manifest looks interesting. The boarding process for the Gulfstream G700 was usually a serene experience. The jet was configured for luxury, only 14 seats, all lie-flat leather with a dining area in the center. Elena boarded first. It was her jet, after all. She took seat 1A, the window seat on the left side, right at the front. It was her favorite spot. She unpacked her noise-cancelling headphones and opened a folder of documents labeled Project Horizon. 10 minutes later, the Sterlings boarded. Abigail stopped dead in the aisle the moment she saw Elena. The cabin configuration was intimate. Seat 1A and 1B were individual seats facing each other across a small table, but separated by the aisle from 2A and 2B. The Sterlings were assigned 1B and 2B. This meant Abigail would be sitting directly across the aisle from Eleanor. No, Abigail said, stopping the line of passengers behind her. Absolutely not. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, stepped forward with a warm, practiced smile. Welcome aboard, Mrs. Sterling. May I take your coat? You may take my coat and then you may move her, Abigail said, pointing a finger inches from Elena's face. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even look up from her documents. I beg your pardon, Sarah asked, her smile faltering slightly. I am not sitting across from her, Abigail hissed. I paid full price for this charter. I expect privacy and I expect to be seated among my peers. I do not want to spend 7 hours to London staring at someone's nanny who got a lucky upgrade. The cabin went silent. A businessman in row 3 lowered his newspaper. Richard put a hand on his wife's shoulder. Abby, just sit down. It's fine. It is not fine. Richard, look at her. Abigail gestured to Elena's leggings. She's dressed like she's going to the gym. It's disrespectful. It's trashy. Elena closed her folder. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. She removed her glasses and looked up. Mrs. Sterling, is it? Elena said. My name is Dr. Vance, and I suggest you take your seat so we can depart on time. Dr. Vance. Abigail laughed, a harsh barking sound. What are you, a doctor of hair braiding? Don't speak to me. You shouldn't even be in 1A. That is the prime seat. How did you get it? Affirmative action booking policy. The racism hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Sarah, the flight attendant, stepped between them. Her face was pale but stern. Mrs. Sterling, I must ask you to lower your voice. Dr. Vance is a valued guest. Your seats are 1B and 2B. Please sit down or we cannot close the doors. I want her moved to the back, Abigail demanded, crossing her arms. There's a jump seat in the galley, isn't there? Put her there. I want seat 1A for my husband, so we can be together. That seat is occupied, Sarah said firmly. By a nobody, Abigail shouted. Do you know who my husband is? He is Richard Sterling, CFO of Sterling Industries. We are Platinum Legacy members with the Charter Alliance. Elena sighed. She reached for the call button, but Sarah was already leaning in. Mrs. Sterling, this is your final warning, Sarah said. No, this is your final warning. Abigail poked Sarah in the chest. Move the black girl, or I will have your job. I will sue this airline into the ground. I will make sure you never serve coffee in a diner again, let alone on a private jet. Move. Her. Now. The tension in the cabin was radioactive. Richard Sterling had buried his face in his hands, seemingly trying to dissolve into the upholstery. Elena looked at Sarah. Sarah, is Captain Miller available? Who do you think you are calling the pilot? Abigail snapped. You think he's going to take your side? He's a professional. He doesn't want to haul trash across the Atlantic either. The cockpit door opened. Captain James Miller, a man with silver hair and 30 years of aviation experience, stepped out. He was an imposing figure wearing 4 stripes on his shoulders. He had heard the commotion. He adjusted his tie and walked to row 1. "Is there a problem here?" Captain Miller asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Abigail lit up, thinking she had found an ally. "Captain, thank God. This stewardess is incompetent. I am refusing to fly next to this woman in 1A. She is aggressive, she is rude, and quite frankly, she doesn't fit the demographic of this flight. I want her moved to the rear immediately." Captain Miller looked at Abigail, then he looked at Richard, and finally he looked at Elena. He didn't look at Elena with annoyance. He looked at her with deference. "Mrs. Sterling," the captain said slowly, "you want me to move the passenger in 1A?" "Yes, immediately," Abigail said triumphantly. "She's obviously some kind of contest winner. Give her a refund and get her out of my face." Captain Miller took a deep breath. He turned to Elena. "Ma'am," Miller said to Elena. "How do you want to handle this?" Abigail laughed. "Why are you asking her? I'm telling you." "Quiet!" Captain Miller's voice boomed, silencing Abigail instantly. "I was speaking to Dr. Vance." Elena unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. She was tall, nearly as tall as Abigail in her heels. She smoothed down her sweater. "Captain Miller," Elena said calmly, "Mrs. Sterling seems to be under the impression that she dictates the seating chart. She does seem to think that." Miller agreed. "She also seems to think," Elena continued, stepping into the aisle and facing Abigail, "that my presence here is a result of charity, or affirmative action." "Well, isn't it?" Abigail sneered, though she was slightly unnerved by the captain's attitude. "You can't afford a $50,000 seat." Elena smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. "You're right, Abigail. I didn't pay $50,000 for this seat." "See?" Abigail turned to the rest of the cabin. "I told you, a freeloader. I didn't pay for the seat," Elena continued, her voice dropping an octave, "because I paid $65 million for the plane." The silence that followed was heavier than gravity. Abigail blinked. "What? This aircraft?" Elena said, gesturing to the gold-plated trim above the overhead bins. "Gulfstream G700 tail number N782EV. Do you know what EV stands for?" "Abigail." Abigail's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the tail number embroidered on the headrest napkin. "EV. Elena Vance." "This is my jet," Elena said, her voice hard as steel. "I allow the charter company to use it when I am not flying to cover maintenance costs. But make no mistake, you are not a customer. You are a guest in my house, and you have just been exceptionally rude to the host." Richard Sterling looked up, his face draining of color. He recognized the name now. Vance, as in Vance Holloway, the company that was currently rumored to be acquiring the logistics firm he worked for. "Oh my God," Richard whispered. "No." Abigail stammered, her face flushing red. That's impossible. You're lying. You're just trying to scare me." "Captain Miller," Elena said, not breaking eye contact with Abigail, "please inform Mrs. Sterling who signs your paycheck." "You do, Dr. Vance," Miller said promptly. "And Sarah?" Elena asked. "You do, Dr. Vance," Sarah said, standing taller. Elena took a step closer to Abigail. "You demanded a black woman move seats. You demanded I be thrown off. You insulted my intelligence, my appearance, and my right to be here." Elena checked her watch. "I have a meeting in London in 8 hours." "I intend to be there." Elena looked at the captain. "Captain, remove them." "What?" Abigail shrieked. "Remove them," Elena repeated. "And their luggage. I don't want their bad energy on my aircraft." "You can't do this," Abigail screamed, grabbing the armrest. We have a contract." "Your contract is with the charter broker," Elena said coolly. "And clause 40 part 3 states that the owner of the aircraft reserves the right to deny carriage to any passenger for conduct deemed unruly, offensive, or threatening. You checked all 3 boxes in under 5 minutes." "Richard, do something," Abigail yelled at her husband. Richard stood up, trembling. "Dr. Vance, please. I apologize for my wife. She's under a lot of stress. We really need to get to London. I have a crucial business meeting." Elena tilted her head. "Mr. Sterling, is it? Who is your meeting with?" It's with the acquisitions team at Vance Holloway." Richard admitted, his voice shaking. The twist landed like a hammer. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Well, Richard, I have some bad news and some worse news. The bad news is you're not getting to London on this plane. The worse news, I am the acquisitions team, and you're going to be very late. You cannot remove us. We are American citizens." Abigail was screaming now, her voice cracking with hysteria. Captain Miller didn't argue. He simply returned to the cockpit and picked up the radio. "Tower, this is Gulfstream, November 782. Echo Victor, requesting Port Authority police to the stand immediately. We have 2 disruptive passengers refusing to deplane. The owner is on board and threatened." Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from awkwardness to pure hostility. The other passengers, a tech investor named David and a young model named Chloe, were no longer hiding behind their magazines. Chloe had her phone out, discreetly recording every second of Abigail's meltdown. "Richard," Abigail clawed at her husband's suit jacket. Tell them who we are." Richard looked like a ghost. He was staring at Eleanor, who had calmly sat back down in seat 1A and put her reading glasses back on. She wasn't even looking at them anymore. It was the ultimate dismissal. "Abby!" Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "Shut up. Just shut up." "What did you say to me?" Abigail gasped. "I said shut up!" Richard roared, startling everyone. "She owns the plane, Abigail. She owns the company I work for. Do you understand what you've done?" Before Abigail could respond, the heavy thud of boots echoed on the jet stairs. 2 Port Authority officers, large and unamused, ducked their heads as they entered the cabin. "Folks," the lead officer said, his hand resting near his belt. "Captain says you're trespassing. Time to go." "Officer," Abigail lunged forward. "This woman is lying. She claims she owns this jet. It's a scam. I want her arrested for fraud." The officer looked at the flight attendant, Sarah. "Is this the owner?" he asked, pointing to Eleanor. "Yes, officer. Dr. Vance is the owner. She wants them removed immediately." The officer nodded to Eleanor. "Dr. Vance, do you want to press charges for trespassing or disturbance of the peace?" Eleanor looked up over her spectacles. The cabin held its breath. "Not today, officer," Eleanor said softly. "I have a schedule to keep. Just get them off my property. And make sure they take their luggage. I don't want to smell her perfume all the way to London." "Let's go," the officer said, grabbing Abigail's arm. "Don't touch me!" Abigail shrieked. She flailed, knocking a glass of water off the side table. It shattered, splashing water onto her Chanel shoes. "That's it," the officer said. He spun her around, securing her wrists behind her back. It wasn't an arrest, but it was a forcible escort. Richard grabbed his briefcase, head hung low, tears of humiliation stinging his eyes. He didn't look at his wife. He walked past Elena. "Dr. Vance," he choked out. "I am so sorry." Elena didn't blink. "Save it for the board meeting, Richard. If you can find a flight that gets you there in time." The officers frog-marched Abigail down the stairs, her heels scraping against the metal steps. She was still screaming about lawsuits and discrimination as they shoved her into the back of a patrol car on the tarmac. From the window of seat 1A, Elena watched the patrol car drive away. She picked up her glass of champagne. Sarah. Yes, Dr. Vance. Tell Captain Miller we are ready for takeoff, and open a bottle of the vintage Dom Perignon for everyone on board. It's a celebration. As the Gulf Stream roared down the runway and lifted into the clouds, leaving the Sterlings on the ground, the cabin erupted in applause. 3 hours later, Richard and Abigail sat in the terminal of JFK, surrounded by the very general public Abigail had despised. They had been released by the police with a stern warning and a temporary ban from the private terminal. But the damage was far from over. Richard had frantically called every airline. The only flight to London that would get them there, even remotely close to the meeting time, was a budget commercial carrier, departing in 45 minutes. And it was fully booked, except for 2 middle seats in row 42, economy, near the toilets. "I'm not getting on that cattle car," Abigail hissed, wiping smudged mascara from her cheek. She was sitting on her Louis Vuitton trunk, looking like a fallen queen. "You have no choice," Richard snapped, his patience incinerated. "My career is hanging by a thread, Abigail. If I miss this meeting, I lose the merger. If I lose the merger, I lose my job. If I lose my job, we lose the house, the cars, and your precious country club membership." Abigail went pale. The reality of the financial threat finally pierced her narcissism. They boarded the commercial flight. It was crowded hot and smelled of stale peanuts. As they walked down the narrow aisle, struggling with their carry-ons, Abigail felt eyes on her. But not eyes of envy, eyes of annoyance. When they reached row 42, Abigail realized she was sitting between a man eating a tuna sandwich and a crying toddler. "Please," she whispered to the flight attendant. "Do you have an upgrade?" "Full flight, ma'am. Take your seat." As the plane took off, Richard pulled out his phone to check his email, hoping for a miracle. Instead, he found a nightmare. The video had dropped. Chloe, the model on the private jet, had uploaded the video of Abigail's tantrum to TikTok. It was captioned, "Racist Karen tries to kick owner off her own private jet. Wait for the ending Tahor Karma, Sarkos Justice." It had 4.2 million views in 2 hours. Richard watched in horror as the video played. There was Abigail poking her finger in Eleanor's face. There was Abigail calling Eleanor trash. And there was the close-up of Eleanor, revealing she owned the jet. The comments were brutal. Imagine being that broke-minded. "I know that guy. That's Richard Sterling from Sterling Industries. Boycott Sterling Industries immediately. That woman is Abigail Sterling. She's on the board of the Children's Charity. Not anymore." Richard's phone began to buzz. It was the CEO of Sterling Industries. Richard stared at the screen, his hands shaking so hard he dropped the phone. "What is it?" Abigail asked, annoyed by the tuna smell. "Who is calling? The end." Richard whispered, "It's the end." For 7 hours, trapped in a metal tube over the Atlantic, Richard and Abigail sat in silence. Abigail tried to sleep, but the toddler kicked her shin every 20 minutes. Richard didn't sleep at all. He just stared at the seat back in front of him, visualizing the destruction of his life. The descent from the stratosphere of the elite to the grimy reality of economy class was not just a physical journey for Richard and Abigail Sterling. It was a 7-hour psychological torture session. The commercial flight to London was a nightmare of their own making. Because they had booked at the last minute, they were seated in row 42, right next to the rear lavatories. Every time the door opened, the smell of chemical disinfectant and stale air washed over them. Abigail sat in the middle seat her Chanel suit wrinkling against the polyester upholstery. She was squeezed between Richard, who was shaking with a silent, vibrating panic, and a backpacker who was eating a pungent egg salad sandwich. "I cannot breathe," Abigail whispered, pulling her silk scarf over her nose. "This is inhumane. When we land, I am suing this airline for emotional distress, and I'm adding that pilot to the list. Who does he think he is?" Richard didn't answer. He was staring at the seatback screen in front of him. He wasn't watching a movie. He was watching the passenger in row 41. The young man in front of them had his phone held up high, connected to the plane's Wi-Fi. On his screen, a video was playing on a loop. Richard could hear the tinny sound leaking from the man's earbuds. It was a shrill voice, screaming, "I want her moved." It was Abigail. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He looked around the cabin. It wasn't just the man in front of them. 2 rows over, a teenage girl was showing her phone to her mother, pointing back toward row 42 and giggling. They knew. The whole plane knew. "Abigail!" Richard hissed, his voice cracking. "Put your sunglasses on." "Why, it's dark." "Just put them on," Richard snapped. "People are staring." "Let them stare," Abigail scoffed, though she adjusted her collar nervously. "They're probably wondering why people of our caliber are back here in the cattle car." The arrival. When the wheels finally slammed onto the tarmac at Heathrow, Richard checked his watch. They had 45 minutes to get to the Vance Holloway headquarters in the financial district. It was tight but doable. Then the second hammer of karma dropped. They stood at the baggage claim carousel for 20 minutes. The carousel spun round and round, spitting out colourful suitcases, backpacks and duct-taped boxes. But the sleek silver Rimowa suitcases belonging to the Sterlings never appeared. "Where is it?" Abigail shrieked at the baggage agent. "My gala dress is in there. My serums—" "I'm sorry, ma'am," the agent said, looking bored. "It seems your bags were routed to Lisbon. We can have them delivered to your hotel in 3 to 4 days. 3 days? Abigail looked like she was going to faint. "We have to go," Richard said, grabbing her arm. His grip was bruising. "We have to go now." They ran through the terminal. Not walked, ran. Abigail Sterling, who hadn't run since a charity 5K in 1998, was sprinting in heels, sweating through her tweed blazer. They burst out into the London rain, only to find the taxi queue was 50 people deep. There were no black cars available, no chauffeurs with placards, just a damp grey line of tired travellers. By the time they finally wrestled their way into a cramped black cab, they looked like wreckage. Richard's tie was crooked, his shirt stained with sweat. Abigail's hair, usually a helmet of hairspray, was frizzed by the humidity. Her mascara had smudged slightly under her left eye, giving her a manic, unhinged appearance. "We look like trash," Abigail whispered, checking her reflection in her compact mirror. "I can't meet the board looking like this." "We don't have a choice," Richard said, staring out the rain-streaked window. "And frankly, Abigail, how we look is the least of our problems." The Lion's Den. The headquarters of Vance Holloway Systems was a monolith of glass and steel that pierced the London skyline. It screamed power. It screamed the kind of money that didn't need to shout. Richard and Abigail rushed into the lobby breathless. The security desk was manned by 3 guards who looked more like Secret Service agents. "Richard Sterling," Richard panted, leaning on the desk. "Here for the acquisition meeting. 2:00 p.m. The head guard looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2:25 p.m. He looked at Richard, then down at a tablet. He didn't smile. "You're expected in the penthouse boardroom. Elevator bank C. They are waiting." "They are waiting." The words hung in the air like a threat. The elevator ride to the 60th floor was silent. As the numbers climbed, Richard felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to smooth his suit jacket, but the wrinkles were set. The doors slid open. The reception area was stark white, minimalist, and freezing cold. A receptionist with perfect posture sat behind a marble desk. She looked up as they exited the elevator. Her eyes lingered for a fraction of a second on Abigail's frizzed hair and the water spots on her silk blouse. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," she said coolly. "You may go right in. The CEO is expecting you." Richard reached for the heavy double doors of the boardroom. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely grip the handle. He took a deep breath, fixed a desperate plastic smile on his face, and pushed the doors open. The boardroom was cavernous. 2 walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of London under a bruised grey sky. In the centre of the room was a table long enough to land a plane on. Seated on the left side were the executives from Sterling Industries. Arthur, the CEO of Richard's company, was there. So was the general counsel and the head of HR. They looked pale. When Richard walked in, they didn't nod. They didn't wave. They looked down at their notepads, avoiding eye contact, as if Richard were carrying a contagious disease. At the head of the table, a high-backed leather chair was turned away from them, facing the window. "Arthur," Richard said, his voice sounding thin in the acoustic expanse of the room. "I am so sorry. The travel arrangements, there was a mix-up with the flights." Arthur didn't look up. "Sit down, Richard." Richard pulled out a chair. Abigail sat next to him. She tried to summon her old arrogance. She placed her Hermes bag on the table, a breach of etiquette, but she needed a shield. "Well," Abigail said, forcing a laugh, "it's been a hell of a day. But we're here. Let's get this merger signed, shall we? I'm sure we can all laugh about this over dinner." "There will be no dinner," Arthur said sharply. He pressed a button on the console in front of him. A massive screen on the far wall flickered to life. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It wasn't a contract. It was the TikTok video. The audio was crisp and amplified by the boardroom's surround sound system. "I don't want to sit next to her. Do you know who my husband is? She's trashy." Abigail watched herself on the giant screen. In 4K resolution, her cruelty looked even uglier. The snarl on her lip, the finger pointing, the sheer, unadulterated hate in her eyes. The video ended. The room was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. "This has been viewed 12 million times," Arthur said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. 12 million. In 6 hours. Our stock price has dropped 8% since the market opened. The hashtag Boycott Sterling is trending globally. Abigail slammed her hand on the table. "It is out of context. That woman, she provoked me. She was sitting there looking smug, and she tricked me. It was a setup. A setup." The voice came from the head of the table. The high-backed leather chair slowly swiveled around. Dr. Elena Vance sat there. She looked nothing like the woman in the leggings from the plane. She was wearing a navy bespoke suit that fit like armor. Her hair was sleek, pulled back in a severe elegant chignon. She wore no jewelry except for the vintage Patek Philippe watch. Her reading glasses were perched on her nose, and she was looking at Abigail over the rim of them with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist examining a bug. Abigail gasped. The sound was audible, a sharp intake of air that sucked the oxygen out of the room. "Dr. Vance," Richard whispered, his soul leaving his body. "Hello, Richard," Elena said calmly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Hello, Abigail. Abigail stammered. "You're the buyer." "I am Vance Holloway," Elena said. "I am the board. I am the acquisition team. I am the money." Elena stood up. She walked slowly around the table, the heels of her Louboutins clicking rhythmically on the polished floor. She stopped behind Arthur, the CEO of Sterling Industries. "Arthur." Elena said, her eyes locked on Richard. We were prepared to offer $40 a share for your company. It was a generous offer. It was based on the assumption that your leadership team was competent, forward-thinking, and stable. We are, Elena. We absolutely are, Arthur pleaded, sweating. Are you... Elena gestured to the screen where the video was paused on Abigail's screaming face. Because this is a liability. This is a rot. She walked until she was standing directly across from Richard and Abigail. Yesterday on my aircraft, which Abigail cost $65 million, not that you asked, you insulted my race. You insulted my intelligence. You tried to have me physically removed by police because you couldn't fathom that a black woman could occupy the same space as you. I didn't know who you were, Abigail blurted out. If I had known... Stop, Elena said. The word was soft, but it hit like a whip. That is exactly the problem, Abigail. You treated me like dirt because you thought I was a nobody. You thought I was powerless. You only treat people with respect when you think they can do something for you. That isn't a mistake. That is a character flaw. And it is fatal. Elena turned to Richard. And you, Richard, you sat there. You watched your wife abuse a fellow passenger, a human being, and you did nothing. You buried your face in your hands because you were embarrassed. Not because you were morally outraged, but because you were embarrassed. Elena leaned forward, placing her palms on the glass table. I cannot merge my company with a culture of cowardice. I cannot have a CFO who lacks the spine to stand up to bigotry even in his own marriage. Richard looked up, tears streaming down his face. Dr. Vance, please. I have worked my entire life for this deal. I have a mortgage. I have 2 kids in college. Please don't let her mistake destroy my life. Her mistake? Elena raised an eyebrow. You are an officer of the company, Richard. You are responsible for the brand. Elena turned back to Arthur. The deal is dead, Arthur. Arthur stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. Elena, please. Wait, we can fix this. We can restructure. Elena paused. She checked her watch. Restructure, she repeated, testing the word. I suppose that is an option. She looked at Arthur. I will proceed with the acquisition on one condition. The toxic element must be removed. Immediately. Visibly. And permanently. Arthur didn't hesitate for a second. The survival of his company and his own golden parachute was on the line. He turned to Richard. Richard, Arthur said, his voice hard, we are exercising the morality clause in your contract. Section 4, paragraph B, conduct unbecoming of an executive that brings public disrepute to the firm. Arthur, you can't, Richard begged. You are fired, Richard, Arthur said. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. You will not return to your office. Your personal effects will be boxed and mailed to you. Fired, Abigail screamed, standing up. You can't fire him. He's the CFO. We will sue you. I will sue every single one of you. Elena laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. With what money, Abigail? Elena asked. Richard just lost his salary. He lost his severance package because he was fired for cause. And judging by the lawsuits currently being filed by the other passengers on that plane for distress and trauma, I imagine your assets will be frozen by the end of the week. Elena pressed a button on the wall. The double doors opened. 4 security guards entered. Get out, Elena said. This isn't fair. Abigail wailed as a guard grabbed her arm. I am a victim here. You're not a victim, Abigail, Elena said, sitting back down in her leather chair and turning away from them to look at the skyline. You're just a passenger who got off at the wrong stop. Richard, do something, Abigail yelled, but Richard didn't move. He stared at his wife with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Don't touch her, Richard said to the guard holding Abigail. Abigail looked at him, hopeful for a second. "Richard, I said don't touch her," Richard said, standing up and straightening his wrinkled jacket. "She can walk out on her own. I don't want to be seen with her." Richard walked out of the room, alone, head bowed. Abigail stood there, the room spinning. She looked at Clarissa. She looked at Arthur. She looked at Elena's back. No one looked at her. "Mrs. Sterling," the guard said, gesturing to the door. Abigail Sterling turned and walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking on the floor, echoing the sound of a life shattering into a million pieces. The fall of the House of Sterling didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a quick bandage rip. It was a slow, agonizing erosion that stripped Abigail of every layer of protection she thought she possessed. The moment Abigail and Richard walked out of the Vance Holloway building, shivering in the London drizzle with their security escorts, the digital guillotine had already dropped. The video hadn't just gone viral. It had mutated into a global symbol of entitlement. It had crossed platforms TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, even the evening news. By the time they landed back in New York, flying economy on a budget carrier, seated separately in middle seats, Abigail's face was a meme. It was plastered everywhere. The jet Karen. The seat 1A snob. The internet detectives had done their work with terrifying efficiency. They hadn't just identified Abigail, they had identified her address, her gym, her favorite restaurants, and the names of every board she sat on. The social excommunication, the first twist of the knife, came 3 days later. It was the day of the Silverleaf Charity Gala, the most exclusive event of the Manhattan social calendar. Abigail had spent 6 months planning her outfit, a custom Oscar de la Renta gown that cost more than most people's cars. She viewed this gala as her fortress. Surely her friends, women she had known for 20 years, women like Clarissa Van Doren and Beatrice Calloway, would stand by her. They were her people. Abigail dressed in the gown, ignoring Richard, who was sitting in his study drinking scotch at 10:00 a.m., staring at a cease and desist letter from his former employer. "I am going, Richard," Abigail announced, fixing her diamonds. "We have to show face. If we hide, we admit guilt." "You're delusional," Richard muttered, not looking up. "They'll eat you alive." "Watch me," she said. Abigail called for her town car service. The account was suspended. Furious, she ordered an Uber Black. When she arrived at the Pierre Hotel, the paparazzi were waiting. But they didn't shout her name to get a good angle. They shouted questions that cut like glass. "Abigail, how does it feel to fly coach?" "Mrs. Sterling, do you have any comment on the diversity lawsuit?" She pushed past them, head high, and marched to the check-in table. The event coordinator, a woman Abigail had tipped generously for years, looked down at her clipboard and then up at Abigail. Her face was a mask of polite pity. "Name." "Don't be ridiculous, Samantha. It's Abigail Sterling. Table 4. Samantha didn't write anything down. She signaled to a large man in a headset standing near the velvet rope. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sterling. Your invitation was rescinded by the board this morning." "Rescinded?" Abigail's voice rose an octave. "I am a platinum donor. Clarissa Van Doren is the chairwoman. Get her out here." "Mrs. Van Doren is actually the one who instructed us," Samantha said quietly. "She specified that your presence would be a distraction to the cause." Abigail froze. She looked past the velvet rope into the ballroom. There was Clarissa holding a champagne flute, laughing with a group of women. Clarissa looked up, saw Abigail standing in the entryway, and didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply turned her back, adjusting her shawl effectively, erasing Abigail from her existence. That was the moment Abigail realized the truth about her high society. It wasn't a community. It was a shark tank, and she was bleeding. The financial dismantling. If the social rejection was painful, the financial ruin was lethal. Richard's contract with Sterling Industries had a clawback clause. Because he was fired for gross misconduct causing reputational harm. The company wasn't just stopping his severance. They were suing to recover his bonuses from the last 3 years. The assets were frozen. The bank accounts were locked. 2 weeks after the gala, the repo day arrived. It was a Tuesday. Abigail was in the kitchen of their penthouse, trying to sell her designer handbags on a resale app because her credit cards were declining at the grocery store. The doorbell didn't ring. It was pounded on. 3 men in grey jumpsuits stood there accompanied by a court-martial. "Mrs. Sterling, we have a writ of seizure for the contents of this property to satisfy the lien held by First National Bank." "You can't come in here!" Abigail shrieked, blocking the door. The marshal gently but firmly moved her aside. "It's over, Mum. Step aside." Abigail watched in horror as strangers' men she would have looked down on a month ago began touching her things. They took the painting over the mantel. They took the antique Persian rugs. One man was wrapping her collection of crystal vases in bubble wrap. "Be careful with that," she screamed. "That's Waterford. It's the bank's Waterford now, lady." The mover grunted. Then came the ultimate humiliation. Richard walked into the room. He wasn't fighting them. He was holding a suitcase. "Richard, stop them!" Abigail cried, grabbing his arm. Richard pulled his arm away. He looked at her with a coldness that was more terrifying than his anger. "I'm not stopping them, Abigail. I'm leaving." "What?" "I spoke to my lawyer, or the legal aid appointed to me since we can't afford the firm anymore." Richard said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'm filing for divorce, and I'm cooperating with the lawsuits against you to try and salvage a fraction of my pension." You're leaving me now," Abigail stammered. "But we're a team." "We were never a team," Richard spat. "I was the bank account. You were the show pony, and now the show is over." He walked out the door, stepping over a roll of bubble wrap, and didn't look back. Abigail was left standing in an echoing, half-empty penthouse, the sound of packing tape the only soundtrack to her life. The reality check 6 months later. The penthouse was gone. The Hamptons estate was seized. The cars were auctioned. Abigail Sterling, formerly of the Upper East Side, was now living in a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a lackluster neighborhood in New Jersey. The radiator clanked all night. The view out the window was a brick wall. She needed money. Desperately. She had applied to act as a consultant, a stylist, a concierge, anything that fit her skill set. But a quick Google search of her name brought up the video. No one would hire her. She was radioactive. Her rent was due in 3 days. She had $42 in her checking account. She swallowed her pride, what little was left of it, and walked into a high-end department store at the local mall. They were hiring seasonal sales associates for the perfume counter. Abigail figured she knew perfume. She knew luxury. She stood in line with teenagers and college students. When it was her turn, she sat across from the hiring manager. The manager was a woman named Chloe. Abigail didn't recognize her at first, but Chloe recognized Abigail. Chloe was the model from the jet, the one who had filmed the TikTok. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. "Name?" Chloe asked, not looking up from the resume. "Abigail." "Smith." Abigail lied. Chloe looked up. Her eyes widened. She tilted her head, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Smith, are you sure about that? You look remarkably like a woman I met on a flight to London once." Abigail's face flushed crimson. She stood up to leave panic rising in her throat. "Sit down," Chloe said, her voice commanding. Abigail sat. "You need this job, don't you?" Chloe asked. Abigail looked at her hands. Her manicure was grown out and chipped. Yes. Chloe leaned back. We are looking for someone to spray samples for customers. It involves standing on your feet for 8 hours, smiling at people who ignore you, being polite to people who are rude, cleaning up the trash they leave behind. Chloe paused. It's exactly how you treated the flight attendants. Do you think you can handle being on the other side of the counter? Abigail fought back tears. I need the money. Good, Chloe said. You start Monday. Minimum wage. And Abigail, if you are rude to a single customer, no matter who they are, no matter what they look like, you're out. Abigail nodded, defeated. She walked out of the store, not as a queen, but as a servant. The final twist. But the story didn't end in a mall in New Jersey. It ended back where the rot had started the Hamptons. The Sterling estate, a sprawling oceanfront mansion that had been the crown jewel of Abigail's ego, was finally put up for auction by the bank to cover the massive debts. It was a dilapidated shell of its former glory, the gardens overgrown, the pool filled with leaves. The auction was held online. Bidders from around the world competed. But one bidder was aggressive. Every time the price went up, this bidder countered instantly. They didn't care about the cost. They wanted the land. The gavel fell. Sold for $18.5 million. 2 weeks later, a black SUV pulled up to the gates of the former Sterling estate. Dr. Elena Vance stepped out. She was wearing a simple trench coat and boots. She walked through the rusted gates past the fountain, where Abigail used to pose for photos. She looked at the house, a monument to vanity. Her assistant Marcus stood beside her with a tablet. The architects are ready, Dr. Vance, Marcus said. Do you want to keep the main structure? It has good bones. Elena looked at the mansion. She remembered Abigail's voice. You don't belong here. No, Elena said softly. Tear it down. All of it. Every brick, Elena said. I don't want the energy of this place to remain. And the new plans? Marcus asked, pulling up a 3D rendering on the screen. Elena smiled. The Vance Aviation Academy for Girls. I want the dormitory right where her master bedroom used to be. I want a flight simulator where her ballroom was. She walked toward the cliff edge, looking out over the ocean. This place used to be a fortress to keep people out, Elena said, the wind catching her hair. Now it's going to be a launch pad to send people up. Elena pulled out her phone. She opened an email from her lawyer. It was a notification that the final settlement from the Sterling lawsuit had come through. She hit reply. Text. Donate the entire settlement amount to the United Negro College Fund in the name of Abigail Sterling. Let's make sure she finally does some good in this world, even if it's against her will. Elena turned back to the car. As she drove away, the first demolition crew truck rumbled past her, heading toward the house. The sound of the engine was powerful, inevitable, and final. Abigail was spraying perfume on the wrists of indifferent teenagers in New Jersey. Richard was living in a basement in Ohio, and Elena Vance was rebuilding the world one broken ego at a time. And that is how quickly the tables can turn. Abigail Sterling thought her status protected her, but she learned the hard way that character is the only currency that matters. She tried to make someone feel small, only to realize she was standing in the shadow of a giant. It's a brutal reminder. Treat everyone with respect, whether they're the CEO or the janitor, because you never know who you're talking to or whose plane you're standing on. If you enjoyed this story of instant karma and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Abigail deserved her fate, or was it too harsh? I'll be reading your replies. Stay safe and fly high.